I got this title from the publisher. And so, the publisher is the one who tells you what your book's going to be called. And when I first got the title, I was annoyed. I was very upset because I'm used to reading, books like, Other People's Children. That's a title, right? And The Light in Their Eyes, you know what I mean? Like, that's a title, Dream Keepers, right? And then they give me culturally responsive education in the classroom. I'm like, how unimaginative can you be? And after I thought about it for a while, I realized, no, that is the perfect title for the book, because that's my lane. People will tell you stay in your lane and they'll be trying to dish you. But, Mother Teresa said, if we're humble, we're neither disgraced, we're not disgraced, and we're not moved by unwarranted praise, because we know who we are. And this is who I am: culturally responsive education in the classroom. If I know anything, I know something about that. So what I want to do is I want to spend some time kind of just setting up these 6 themes that I have come to use to operationalize my understanding of culturally responsive education. And culturally responsive education, I think of as a pedagogy that is effective for closing equity gaps. Now, operationalize is a really important word to me. It's a word that I first found in the work of Gloria Ladson-Billings, one of the 4 people who I think of as a matriarch of culturally responsive education: Gloria Ladson-Billings, Sonia Nieto, Geneva Gay, and Lisa Delpit. These are the people who I think of as having the most impact in the literature and the conceptual understandings of what it is we mean by culturally responsive education. My study of CRE, it's interesting, right? Because I feel like for all social scientists, our research almost always has some kind of an autobiographical bent. And so I'm a kid from New York City. I'm from the Bronx, New York, more specifically, right? Because Bronx is kind of like New York City, but Bronx is its own, unique thing. And I feel like I owe, so much of my life to teachers, and these teachers who provided me with a vision, really, for what I could do with my life and what kind of a thinker I could be. And I had teachers who went above and beyond what was required of them by the letter of the contract, and they reached me. And people look at me now and you see me as a kind of polished person and a professional person, and I am that, but I wasn't always that, and it wasn't easy for people to see the potential in me when I was robbing people on the train in the 80s, which was just kind of like what we did in my neighborhood. So operationalize is this word that has so much meaning for me, because when it comes to something like equity, there are a lot of people, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, but there are a lot of people who can speak articulately and poetically about equity. And that's a good thing, I suppose. But I am less concerned with your wonderful articulations of equity, and I am much more concerned with your ability to operationalize it in a school and classrooms with actual human children. I mentor a group of Black and brown boys here in the Denver area, and one of the things that I always tell them is that if I had a drone that was taking pictures of you all day, no audio, just images, that drone, if it followed you for 24 hours, I should be able to look at those images collected, and without any audio, I should be able to discern what your goals are. I should be able to just from the images, I should be able to pick out evidence that tells me this is what you're trying to do with your life. These are your core values. This is what's important to you. And I feel similarly about this idea of equity. And again, I think of culturally responsive education as a pedagogical approach to closing equity gaps. So Yeah, when I work with teachers in my work, I have worked at Teachers College, I've worked at NYU, and I got my doctorate at American University in Washington, D.C., all in teacher education programs. And so I'm a big fan of teacher education, protecting the integrity of colleges of education, teacher of education programs. That's a very important subject for me. Schools, the idea of public schools. I'm in love with the idea of public schools. I think it's something that is uniquely American and essential to the democracy. And, I think about the current moment that we're in where half of our country believes, has one worldview and the other half of our country has another worldview. And it's increasingly difficult for us to be able to cross those bridges and communicate with each other. I think about a theme like rigor. And I wonder, have our schools done a good job of preparing the citizenry to think critically, to discern information, to be able to recognize logical fallacies and understand when the manipulation that the information that they're exposed to is manipulating them. So I think of schools as this deeply important American idea that we must do everything in our power to protect. These 6 themes that I've used to operationalize this idea of culturally responsive education came from, first, my work as a professional development provider. I work with in-service teachers. So a lot of my work is, I'm not teaching courses anymore. I have taught, foundations, legal issues in education, even intro to teaching and learning. I love to teach intro to teaching and learning. So I've been in the pre-service course teaching world, but most of my work now is done in real speed with in-service teachers. So my favorite model is a residency. And in a residency, I'll spend X amount of hours. In the old days before the pandemic, I'd spend a week with a teacher, and I would inhabit their classroom. I used to tell them, we're going to be work spouses for a week. We meet early before work. We're planning out our goals for culturally responsive learning experiences for our kids. We're co-teaching those. We're reflecting. We're revising our planning, and we are creating this thought loop where we introduce these big ideas, these concepts that, if we're familiar with them, will more likely lead us to equitable practices, culturally responsive practices. And for in-service teachers, it's a model that works really well. It's time and labor intensive, but often for in-service teachers, they have so much on their mind, they can be difficult to reach in more traditional kind of PD platforms. So these 6 themes are basically over the course of about a decade working in these kinds of ways. These are the 6 big ideas that I found that, if they can be developed well in the teacher mindset, they can show up in the toolkit. This becomes, I make a lot of art references in my work, it becomes a sort of canvas on which the teacher begins to create. And what I'd like to do today is, and these are themes that we are familiar with, and yet the deeper dive into the themes allows us to reach different levels of understanding. So what I want to do right now is I'm going to show about an 8-minute clip from a video that illustrates what some of the work has looked like with a particular team. And this is a video that I call the family narrative video, and it features the voices of 4 teachers, Title I school, Aurora, Colorado, all the risk factors in the classroom. The kids always look like perfect little angels on video. These are every single one, well, not every single one, but most of these kiddos are fully capable of cussing you out. You're not a real teacher in my mind unless you've been cussed out like recently by a kid. And then really, right, you're not a real teacher unless you've been cussed out by a kid in the morning, and then that same kid comes back to your classroom and gives you a hug in the afternoon. Now I know those are the teachers that I understand and that understand me. So I want to just play this and give you a sense of how a team operationalize these values. And I'm going to play just about half of the video, about 8 minutes, and then I'll give you the link to the full video if you want to finish watching it later on. So without further ado.
What we wanted kids to do was interview their parents and figure out a theme that goes throughout their life. So they took home interview questions, they interviewed their parents, and then they came back and they had to figure out, were my questions deep enough so that I can get an answer of what their theme is? And if not, then I need to go back and figure out a theme in their life. I need to ask these questions that are deep enough so that I can figure out a theme in my parents' life.
This project is really good because it brings you closer to your family. I asked my mom some questions and it really brought me closer to her. I really didn't know all this stuff about her, but now it makes me think her a whole different way. I respect her more.
Well, I personally wanted the kids to connect with their families and learn stories about their families and their family members, and just deepen their relationships with people, with the family members they feel close to. And also, we wanted them to understand the bigger idea of themes in people's lives and how, all of us humans have stories and experiences, and sometimes we have common themes in our lives and common life lessons and takeaways from various experiences. And we wanted the kids to see that, like, if you ask the right questions or if you take the time to interview a family member, you'll learn these cool stories about your families, but also you can find these common themes that maybe your classmate found in their family as well.
So we were helping kids figure out what is theme, how does theme relate to your family. So for some families it was, I have a resilient family, or we've been through a lot but we're still hopeful for more, or we've had struggles and struggle creates character. Something to that effect of that your family has an underlying theme, and sometimes it's from many generations and sometimes it's just within this current generation of you have to have a struggle in order to get what you want.
So how we're doing these interviews in this project, how is that helping you with your reading and writing later?
It will help me with kind of realize what a good writer will look like, and be able to kind of judge books better and maybe see if they have enough elaboration, but then also take from what I've read to then and find theme. Definitely find theme. That's a big one. And then take it and then use it in my writing from what other readers can do.
I learned a lot about just the families and the kids and the home lives that they're coming from, and the experiences of their families coming to this. A lot of them coming to this country, they were refugees in other countries, or they came from really bad circumstances in other countries, and so it was enlightening to hear those stories.
We are honoring a text that is the story of our students' families' experiences that I expect to be tremendously empowering for a lot of our kids.
Grandfather's story really affected me, and affected me because I never got to my grandfather, and I would feel hurt if I had grandchildren and they never got to meet me. I would feel hurt, just like I feel hurt that I never got to meet my grandfather.
I wanted the kids to take away the sense that, that they can talk to their family members, that their family members have a history and a very interesting past. And I wanted them to learn to speak to their family members more and to have that conversation and share stories more. And that's exactly what happened. A lot of my kids had said that they never talked to their parents about their lives. They were very interested in a lot of the stories that their parents said. I even had one kid say, I didn't know I could just talk to my mom about things. So it was exactly what I wanted.
Like, it made me feel closer to my dad, like connected to the story about him joining the marching band and liking music and liking the trumpet. Made me feel more connected to him because he likes music like I do, and that's how I feel, and that's how I got affected. Because I never knew that he joined the marching band. So that's something that I learned.
Honestly, the planning was intensive. We started with Yummy, and we were talking about what are our learning targets? What do we really want kids to get from this? And he had brought to us the read, write, think. It was kind of a skeleton. It was a family narrative that we had gone from, and so he brought us that, and a teammate and we kind of used that as our skeleton, and were responsive to what our kids were going through. So we would do a couple of days, look to see kind of what they were getting from it, and then add what we needed to really be able to get kids to see theme within their families. So
Going through the QFT, the question formulation technique, to help them like create those probing questions for their interviews was also very rigorous. Having them write their family narratives was also pretty rigorous for a lot of students. And some students, it was just even like extracting or finding that theme.
So creating the questions was our first point of rigor. The kids first started with a tremendous amount of closed questions versus open-ended questions, and then they had to take those closed questions and turn them into open-ended questions. So that was, took some flexible thinking for them. Asking the questions and interviewing their parents, they actually recorded it, and when they came back to school to start writing about it, if they realized that there was missing pieces, they had to know that they could go back and re-interview and ask for more questions. Also, finding theme in an event in somebody's life can be very difficult. Theme is a very complex thing. So that was a lot of the rigor, and just learning how to ask questions and draw the details you want, and then ask responsive questions according to the answers.
I would tie more to my mom about how she met my dad, because she didn't give me all the juicy details, she just gave me some, which I want all the juicy details.
How do you think that this project is going to help you further down with reading and writing?
I think it'll help me with reading to find like the theme in books and like help me have empathy when I'm reading a book, and in writing to like do more like transitions and like feelings in my writing. I felt like it was a way to help me persevere through hard times and like challenge me to go beyond the surface level.
What do you mean by that?
Like, at the beginning, I just wanted to stick with the first one, but then I realized if I couldn't do that, I could go even farther, and I could always keep on continuing.
What do you mean the first one and continuing? What were you continuing with?
I was continuing on elaborating and putting in more detail.
Okay, so I'm going to pause it there, and then I will share with you a link so that you can watch the rest of that video if you'd like. And then also I have, you could screenshot this if you wanted to, but I will send you a link. I'll give you a link on the back end of this presentation. But as I put a wrap on this part of the talk, for me, family and families' narratives are not just a nice thing to tangentially consider. They are texts, and they are texts with which our students have a certain expert level fluency. And so if the goal is to teach my students how to analyze and synthesize and summarize and create, those goals are not limited to just merely applying at, traditional text that we think of as already existing in the canon. Our students' family's narrative, if I can put my student in a position where you will be successful in school, you will demonstrate your competence by being able to translate these rich stories that you have access to in the home. You can translate those in ways that perform your understanding of a big idea like theme, that then deepen your understanding of what it means to elaborate, what it means to revise, what it means to add meaningful, rich detail. The one kid, all right, who said, I would ask my mother more questions because she gave me, some of the details, but not all the juicy details. That's incredibly rich to me, right? Because that kid is saying, I felt like I was on the verge of getting to a piece of information that, for whatever reason, I'm very curious about why mom didn't want to reveal, the origin story of her relationship with dad. But it's immensely valuable for this kid's intellectual development to recognize when the information they're seeking has not yet been made available to them. That's a skill that not only supports her identity as a writer, that's a skill that supports her identity as a student, and it becomes the justification for her investment in school. So one of the things that I'm encouraging you to think about, and then wouldn't love to talk about, is making sure that our commitments to family and community engagement don't exist merely at the margins of instruction, that they can become central to how our students learn the valuable understandings that will define them as thinking beings for the rest of their lives. So Rosanne, I'm going to pause there, and I'm also going to defer to you in terms of any adjustments that we want to make.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. Yemi, do you mind just talking for one or two more sentences about what we were talking about this morning is bridging kids' identity in school and in their community or their family. Do you mind doing that?
Yeah, I might need. Okay, give me like 4 sentences.
Okay, 4.
So,
okay.
Because there's really 2 points. One is, some students come to school with cultural fluencies that are aligned with the dominant cultural ways of being, the premises on which schooling is done. So we know that if we are measuring achievement by, these profoundly flawed, high-stakes standardized testing, we know that zip code and mother's educational background are the most predictive data points to a kid's achievement on these tests. What that really means is that the more time you spend in, predominantly white, predominantly male, right, middle class to affluent cultural spaces, the more fluencies you have that serve you well in school. So that's one thing, right, is that we are advantaging some students merely by the cultural indoctrinations that they have prior to school, and we're disadvantaging others whose family spaces, whose cultural spaces are not defined by those same cultural fluencies. But then there's this other thing where we're putting a lot of our students in a situation where they believe that in order to be successful in school, they have to turn off a part of their identity to succeed. Mm-hmm. And we can teach in ways that confirm that all of your identity is invited to the learning space, not as a gesture of kindness. I'm kind of over that, right? Like I'm kind of over, like when I see those videos on social media, I try not to judge because judging is bad for my karma, right? But like when I see like white educators doing the high fives and the fancy handshakes with Black and brown kids entering their classrooms, I'm like, I hope that's just a symbol of the relationship. And but because like if people get the idea that that's what we mean by culturally responsive, that's what we mean by equitable, that's not enough for me. What I need is a kiddo to recognize that when you are searching for that connection, that conceptual connection, what is this like? What does this make me think of? What ideas do I already have with me that I can use to leverage a deeper understanding? I want them thinking not only about what they've learned in their previous formal academic experiences, I want them thinking about the conversation that they had with their Nana while they were gardening. I want them thinking about things that they've heard and discussed and talked about with their family on a trip to the grocery store. The more that my students see their social and cultural identity from outside of school as being useful to them in building competencies in school, the more they'll be willing to invest. And so we have to think about this explicitly, or we will continue to marginalize some and advantage others.
Very, very cool. So thanks, Yemi. So you can see the people on the call this morning, you can see why at the Center for Urban Ed, when Yemi's book was published in December of 2019, we figured out some ways to get many copies of it. And so we just have done a book study with Yemi's book this fall at the center. And what we know about successful organizations is that they build consensus about core values. And so at our center, we've been reading, doing book studies for the past few years. We started a couple of years ago with a book about, first generation college students, and what is a woman who did her PhD in Minnesota, published her findings about how universities can reimagine themselves to support first generation college students. It was just a really cool process. So when we got our hands on Yemi's book for this fall, it was really, really fun. And I encourage fun and significant. I encourage you all to do the same, to gather in community with other colleagues and really study Yemi's thinking. Because I was just talking earlier this morning about our coming together today on November 11th and the significance of Veterans Day. Because Yemi does such a beautiful job in his book about talking about how important it is for people to be sensitive and careful culturally and racially for our democracy to thrive. And we have evidence of, over the past 4 years and before, maybe the past 4 years have just, brought things to the fore, but where we have, we fail at our work to really be in community with everybody, including people who are different from us, depending on how we define different. So anyway, as you read Yemi's whole book, to really think about what significance, Yemi, your big ideas play or have in terms of strengthening our, like you said earlier, our schools and then in the big scheme of things, our democracy is really, really important. So what we want to do, the other thing is the very last sentence in Yemi's book. There's this, you're talking about themes, but there's this common theme throughout the book is how brilliant can we all be? And the more brilliant we all are in teacher education, the more brilliant our teacher candidates can be. And then, more we can support and nurture brilliance of all learners, K through 12 too. So Damien, it's cool you're here at the school district level. I love that. So what we're going to do is break into groups, and each group will have one theme. So Brittany's helping us here. I really appreciate that, Brittany. So what we'll do is 4 groups instead of 6. So each group will have one of the themes, and Yemi posted a 1-page document in the chat, and I wonder if everybody has access to that, because we have the 2 questions for you to grapple with in your groups related to whichever theme your group ends up with. So does everybody have access to the 2 questions? The first question is, what is the definition of the theme that your group has? So let's say your group has engagement as a theme. What is the definition of engagement? And really, I think in education, it's so easy for us to say there's nothing new here. In other words, it's the same idea we talked about 30 years ago, and it just has a new name. So what we want you to do in your group is to think, what part of the definition that Yemi has here in chapter 3 is something I already knew, and what part adds to my understanding of what engagement is as a theme in under the umbrella of culturally responsive education. So does that make sense? So think about what's the definition and what's new in terms of what Yemi's presenting in his chapter 3. And then the second question is, what's the application of the theme in teacher preparation, in our work with teacher candidates? So without any further delay, we'll just move into the groups. And then we can pop in and out so we can help. But in each group, it'd be so helpful if you identify recorder/reporter, so that then when we come back together again, the groups can report out about the kinds of conversations you had, and we can just talk as a larger group about the importance of the themes of culturally relevant, culturally responsive education. Sound good?
Expanding the toolkit as opposed to limiting the pedagogical options we have.
And can I just say that we are an education program housed in an English department, and that's really hard because they believe you should be teaching canonical stuff and even canonical ethnic lit. You know, what are the classics of ethnic or minority literature? And they do not understand that the content is really insignificant to us. What matters more is what we're aiming for. And it's the same reason when we talk with students about canned lessons. You can't do it. It's not your room, it's not your students, it's not your city, it's not your day. And so that's why we emphasize the skills, but it's really challenging for teacher educators housed in content departments who value content over pedagogy. And it's something that we wrestle with every time we try to cut credit. We built a pedagogy class in social and emotional learning into our program. So we have a separate methods class on that. I had to cut 3 credits of English. It was like a dog fight because I wanted to cut restoration drama or something like that. And so we really need advocates of saying, look, this is what teaching is. It's not what you think it is at the university level. It's a completely different experience in K-12. And it should be different at the university, but I'm not fighting that battle.
So let's move to cultural identity, okay? Just so that we can get all 4 of the themes that the groups represent on the table, and then talk about connections between the themes. That's a fun piece too.
Yeah, actually, Rosanne, we did that. Jeff and Christine, the 3 of us did that one, Rosanne. And you just finished with something that I wanted to open with, and that is, as I was looking at the pie, right? It's a casserole, right? Like all of these things inform each other, right? And so it's impossible for us to talk about cultural identity without talking about vulnerability and relationships, right? Which are 2 of the themes that we ended up, crossing over into, if you will. So just wanted to put that out there, that graphically, this should really look maybe a little bit different. Was maybe more of a Venn diagram. But anyway, we got a little bit of a slow start, but that's fine. But once we got going, we didn't really do a hard definition of cultural identity as a team. So while I was listening just now, I did my best to chicken scratch it a little bit, but it goes back to what Yemi said earlier, where he said, we may think we understand a student's cultural identity by looking at them, right? Maybe the physical attributes that they bring to the table. And we can make some really false assumptions when we do that, right? Based on biases and stereotypes and all types of things. But this idea of cultural identity, I think really it's owned by the student, right? It's not owned by the teacher. And so it's incumbent upon us too, like Yemi said, really get to know our audience, get to know our students. And that's one of the things we tell our teachers in our teacher prep program is, we've all heard the stereotype that Asian students are going to be your best math students, right? If you've got Asian students, watch out, that's going to happen. Completely unfair, to just make that assumption. You need to get to know all of your students. So for the reasons that Yemi elaborated on. So I just want to say that cultural identity, it covers so much, because culture is inclusive of religion, it's inclusive of ethnicity, it's inclusive of, I'm going to even say, like, sometimes race crosses over with ethnicity in ways that we can't even expect, right? That we're surprised by. An example is, let's say we have a child that's adopted from another country into a white family or a black family or a brown family. And suddenly we make assumptions that we see this child that they have a certain, they'll have a certain racial or ethnic profile that they don't actually have because of the way they were raised, right? Within their family. So you have your family culture. Super complex stuff here, but it's fascinating to me. But my point is that it's not easy. You have to take the time to get to know your students, right? Their cultural identity as individuals, because even if they are, so I'm from Arizona, we had students, a lot of students that were Native Americans from the neighboring reservations. Even within that community, they didn't all share the same cultural identity as Native Americans. And that was clear once you got to know them, right? And I think you all know what I'm talking about when I share that example from your own context and experiences. So let's move on then to some of the application. That's where we spent most of our time, actually. And so one of the things that we thought would be important in a teacher prep program is to make sure that our candidates understand that really you can't get anywhere without a basic level of trust with your students, between yourself and your students. So having an authentic relationship with your students, being authentically interested in who they are, not just superficially interested to, like Yemi said, I'm going to like you to death, right? No, like that's not what it's about. It's authentic relationship, right? To really get to what that girl said, the juicy stuff, right? That's where we all want to get to, because that's where the good stuff is. So establishing trust, not just between teacher and student, but students and students within your classroom, right? Because you have your own culture in your classroom, right? That's another level. We all assume different masks in different contexts, right? And in the classroom, our students and us as educators, we have to assume that cultural mask as well. And so helping that classroom climate and culture develop from a place of trust so that you can have the necessary conversations about cultural identity so that you can best serve those students. And I privately chatted with Yemi about this, this idea between serving or saving students, right? If you're familiar with Paul Gorski's work, that's what his work is all about. We're not here to save our students, we're here to serve our students. And so you can't serve them though if you don't know them. So the other sort of bullet point that we came across for application was establishing an environment where you can embrace constructive discomfort, right? So it's not that, well, again, it goes back to what Yemi said about being kind. Sometimes conversations are uncomfortable. That's okay so long as it's constructive discomfort, right? It's going in a direction that's positive and productive, right? Don't try to steer away from those conversations or those moments, actually embrace them. But you can't get there unless you have that baseline of safety and security, right? This goes back to Maslow. So
Yeah.
I've dropped Gorski and Maslow. Yeah.
Yeah. Who else was in your group? No, you said Christine, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you for all of that. Christine, do you want to add anything specifically?
Well, I was just going to add that we talked about co-constructing our curriculum, and that it's that you're a facilitator and that you're helping the student. You know what your objectives are, of course, but you're using inclusion in every sense of the word, so that the curriculum is developed with everyone in the classroom. And it's very thoughtful, and the students are very thoughtful in their development because it's meaningful to them.
Yeah, thank you. Yemi, is it okay if we go to relationships, or do you want to?
No, that's fine. Yeah, I'm
okay,
just kind of running.
Okay, good. Okay, so I wonder who was in the relationships group. Okay, Damien. Oh, okay, so yeah, good. Do you want to just, yeah, perfect. You want to report out a little bit, Damien?
Sure. Yemi, did you want to report out? I know you said you have some ideas.
I'm yielding to you.
Okay, thank you.
Away from our conversation that you share.
So it was myself and Yemi in relationships, and I told him as I was watching the video that was shared with us, I was really thinking about myself, and I was thinking about the fact that I have a 7-year-old. She's on the spectrum. One of her accommodations is that we start the school day in the classroom, so we don't line up outside. So last year, every morning I'd take her in about 10 minutes early, and we'd sit in the classroom. And the teacher is young. It's a predominantly white school, more affluent. Teacher is young and white, and that's where she went to school, same elementary school. And thinking about this video and in this project that these kids were doing, the question that I wrote down on the piece of paper was, do you see me? And I don't think my daughter's teacher ever saw me. And I was there every single morning with this beautiful little girl to start her school day, but she never saw me. And the other parents, they don't see me. And so thinking about that relationship piece, how powerful, how special, how meaningful it's going to be that these children get to see their families,
Yeah.
but that the teachers get to see them. So that when a parent walks in, that teacher sees them and they can appreciate that. You know, so we talked a little bit about that on the relationship piece. I wanted to share that out. Yemi, is there anything else that you wanted to add to that?
You know, the only thing that I would add very quickly, and picking up on what Jeff was talking about, what Jeff and Kris were talking about, is this intersection between cultural identity and assets. Because you and I had also started talking about assets, and so I don't want to steal the thunder of the assets group, but you are better positioned to recognize the assets of another human being when you share cultural frames of reference. And I mean, there's a whole, you know, body of literature on attribution theory. You are more likely to see them as an individual motivated by circumstances rather than to globally label them with limited information. When you have that cultural identity that connects you to another person, you see them in multiple dimensions. And so, yeah, no, that was just something that in our relationships conversation, and again, to your point, Jeff, one of my indicators that my teachers that I'm working with in in-service conditions, when they really get it, because I'll kind of like quiz them, I'll say, okay, give me your definition for, you know, relationships. And then they'll say, oh, you know, it's so hard for me now. I can't describe relationships without talking about assets. And I'm like, that means you're getting it. Because that means now that you're understanding these themes in a way that can really be operationalized rather than just regurgitated. So, so yeah, I just want to piggyback on those 2 points.
And just one quick thing in closing, if I can, on that relationships piece. I did share with Yemi that I was a Denver Public Schools kiddo, always, but I ended up having to go to Chatfield Senior for the last semester of my senior year, just because of circumstances. And I shared with Yemi very honestly, my first day at Chatfield was so shocking to me. I literally did not know that there was that many white people anywhere in the world. I just didn't. It had never been my experience. And I was feeling very marginalized for the first time in my life and feeling very lonely. So I went to the library to look for anything that I could find that was written by somebody with a last name like mine. And I ended up picking up Rudolfo Niles' Bless Mi Ultima. And I said, that was the first time that I'd ever seen myself or my grandparents or my aunts and uncles or my cousins in a piece of literature, in a book written down. And I had to discover that by myself. But I think what was most amazing is I had read a lot of literature before Anaya's Bless Mi Ultima, but what I definitely know I walked away with after Bless Mi Ultima was it opened up these doors in which I could see my common humanity through other literature. So now I could go read Steinbeck with a different lens and understand it in a different way. But I had to see myself in literature first. I had to. That wasn't happening until I actually saw myself in the literature first.
Yeah.
So that's another one of those relationship pieces that we talked about.
I have 12 brothers and sisters, and several are really working poor. And my sister is a single mom. She married a black guy, so her kids are, you know, biracial, and they both look fully black, really. And so when you're talking, Damien, about being seen or not, she always lamented that not, you know, that her sense of the context was that certain teachers saw some parents, but they never saw her based on her, you know, their perception of her disconnect from her own 2 kids. You know how painful that is? I mean, that is just amazing. And, you know, we're all good people. We're all really good people. So how in the hell does that happen? You know, regularly. So she feels increasingly disenfranchised, you know, as an advocate and for the kids, and the kids can read her emotion, you know, all of that stuff. It's really intense. Thanks for that. Thanks so much for that. The fourth group had vulnerability, right? So who's in the fourth group?
That was me and Kathy, and I don't want to follow Damien. I don't want to follow you, Damien. But I think, Damien, as you were speaking, I think your experiences and your relatability is what makes you such a great family engagement liaison in Jeffco, because the families, I'm certain, can relate to your experiences as a student in DPS, as a parent. Anyway, so it actually feeds right into vulnerability. And I have to first admit that when Kathy and I got into the room together and I saw that we were group 4, I'm like, oh hell, because it's not that I don't agree with or appreciate vulnerability. I absolutely do. But my experience has been that so many conversations right now stay with vulnerability and don't move into what does that mean for action. So I had to roll my eyes, and then I got over it. And so Kathy and I, and Kathy, please chime in if I misrepresent anything. But we first talked about how vulnerability is really taking chances without fear of what will happen when you take those chances. We also talked about, and Kathy mentioned her own experience of moving from being a teacher in Huntington Beach, California, and then moving to Grand Junction, Colorado, and how there were very different demographics of students that she was working with. And so then we started talking about how a lot of teachers are fairly comfortable in having conversations and being vulnerable with their students in the classroom, but when it comes to having relationships with families, they're very intimidated, because oftentimes it leads to why, we're having this week is because there's a lack of preparation often in ed prep programs around working with families in the community. So we talked about being willing to try something new. I'm just looking down at my notes here. We talked about how in prep programs, but then I think also in PD and in-service, just providing opportunities to practice and model vulnerability. So professors, faculty can model this with their pre-service students. And then when we get to be in the classroom, we can model this with our students. And then Kathy and I started talking about how as we get older, and I don't know if all of you are in the same boat as us, but I think we're more willing to be vulnerable and show vulnerability as we get older. And I think that comes with confidence as well and more experiences. So then I started thinking about how do you teach or give opportunities to practice vulnerability with 20-somethings, when you're talking about the majority of prep students, or with your high school students or even elementary school students who are afraid to fail. So we talked about that. And then I'm still grappling in my mind a bit with how to balance showing vulnerability, but keeping professionalism, and sort of keeping the boundary that sort of needs to happen, I think, between a teacher and students, but at the same time, still being relatable. So those are just some things that we talked about. Kathy, what did I miss?
You covered it all. I want to kind of echo what Jeff was saying as far as all these things have to work together. And with vulnerability, you have to have relationships with your students and with your parents in order to be vulnerable and to model that vulnerability. And a lot of times, what I was talking with Darcy about, there's a language barrier. I mean, I remember teaching in California, and I had 36 students, and 3 of them were white English-speaking students, and the rest of them were from all over. And there were language barriers, and it was hard to, I was young, real young for first-year teacher, second-year teacher, and I wasn't willing to be vulnerable and say, I don't know how to help you. I don't know how to understand your language. I don't know how to help your child adjust. And that vulnerability was really difficult. We've got to be willing to take chances and use tools that are available to us to build those relationships and become more vulnerable for our parents to help our kids grow.
Yeah, and just far more opportunities, I think, to practice and not be afraid to make mistakes. And I think that's particularly difficult when you're talking about culture, right? And knowing that it's as Mavis, as Dr. Sanders was talking about on Monday, you know, it's a predominantly white teaching population, I think especially in Colorado, teaching students of color. And you know, we need to be okay with having difficult conversations, Jeff, as you were talking about, but having that baseline of safety and security, which I think is so critical. Anyway, that's what we chatted about.
So we have, thanks so much, Darcy and Kathy. So Yemi, we have about like 6 minutes, right? So do you wanna talk, you know, just lead the conversation about the intersection of the themes and the, I can't remember what Jeff said. So instead of a pie, it should be a
casserole.
A casserole, yeah.
However you want to make
anyway,
that a
so
graphic.
Yeah, so I'm going to share this screen again, just kind of picking up on the thinking around vulnerability. So yeah, I agree with a lot of what you're saying in terms of, you know, that Brene Brown interpretation of vulnerability, right? Like what's required of me as a teacher in modeling vulnerability. I think that's one of the keys to authenticity. You know, I'm working on another book right now, which I think is going to be the art of CRE in the classroom, and just kind of learning from artists about ways that we can make our practice more culturally responsive. And so one of the things that the metaphor is, right, where a painter creates on a canvas, a teacher creates through the canvas of experience. And so we are creating these experiences that connect our students to us. Vulnerability, when we're thinking about our students' vulnerability, I was really pushing back against the idea of at risk. The idea that our students are somehow fundamentally flawed upon entering the classroom. And so we got to be careful about recognizing the risk factors, but making sure that we are not reducing our understanding of who our students are merely by the risk. So there's another, we can go too far in this direction of being so certain in our ability to serve our students that we think we need to overlook the risk and pretend that the risk isn't there. Well, the risk is real, but risk is mitigated by a corresponding protective factor. And so when I'm working with my teachers and we're thinking about this theme of vulnerability in particular, it's like, okay, so let's recognize that there's a risk. Let's think carefully about how this risk might undermine this student's opportunity in this learning experience. And let's think about the protective factors that need to be in place to match or mitigate that risk. Just doing that requires us to really check the assumptions, those, you know, the implicit biases, right? Like, and I know the implicit aptitude test is under fire right now, but the device that we had been using to try to measure implicit bias, you know, that's a difficult thing to measure because the device is flawed doesn't mean that there's no such thing as implicit bias. As we learn our concepts, we learn what we think of as appropriate and inappropriate expressions of the concept, and that's the substance of bias. But in looking at culturally different others, we are more likely to misunderstand vulnerability. And when we are so we will overlook, you know, as again, Damien's talking about, we'll overlook the assets that a family brings to bear because those assets don't look like the assets that we were familiar with in our own home cultural spaces. So for me, with the 6 themes, if I put the 6 themes back up, what I've come to do is I use a lot of questions, and I would encourage you in your work with teachers and thinking about family and community engagement to move them away from thinking in terms of a simple checklist. And I know you're already doing this. I can tell this is a really thoughtful group. But really what we're activating for them, our learners, our teacher in-service and pre-service teachers, we're activating these habits of inquiry, these questions that they automate into their thinking. And again, I'm a pedagogy person, so into the design of your instruction. And if you are asking yourself these kinds of questions, you're more likely to be thinking about the right stuff in the right ways. Initially with these 6 themes, it was really about, trying to create something, a model that could work with the limited amount of professional development time that I had with teachers. So I couldn't often try to attack all of culturally responsive education. I had to try to unpack it into these actionable ideas that then over time teachers could mix into the casserole and bake into the casserole. So yeah, what I like to do with these big ideas is I'll ask teachers at this on the face of it, what resonates for you most? And then we'll do the deep dive in there. A lot of times in predominantly white spaces, and they see me and I'm Black, and they're like, oh, we're gonna stay as far away from race as possible. So we'll talk about rigor. Yeah, he won't be able to make anything racial about that. And then, we define rigor as not content dependent, as a function of the targets for thinking. How do we want students thinking and at what level of complexity? And if we're thinking in terms of extended thinking, the most complex, most rigorous ways of thinking, making connections with the big ideas that we're learning in school, with the big ideas that we bring to bear, well, there's no way that that can't include the full range of a student's identity. There's no way that my thinking can be fully rigorous if only part of my identity is available to me in my thinking. So that is one of the ways, right, that the themes will come together and we'll find the intersections. And in my experience, and I encourage you to take this for whatever it's worth for you, when I give my in-service teachers that I'm working with big ideas, like these themes to think about and play with, and then we actually apply it to designing learning experiences. If I just have them thinking separate and apart from the doing of planning instruction, a lot doesn't stick. But it's in the design of a learning experience. And then in my residencies, I'll go in, I'll plan myself into the learning experience so we can feel when the engagement ticked up. We can feel when our students were meeting our expectations for rigorous thinking. We can feel when the assets are being leveraged in the ways that we want them to be. And when that happens, teachers develop their own handle on what we mean by culturally responsive education. And then they become brilliant in their own unique right, Roseanne. So, yeah.
Yeah, I love it. I love that. So Brittany and Darcy and Christy, thanks so much. It's just been so wonderful to spend the time together. And what I love about the 21st century is we can stay connected, beyond the scope of this hour and a half. Thanks so much, Yemi.
Thank you, everybody. And one thing I've been saying to everybody is, this is the hardest year to be a teacher in the history of the world. Yeah. And so, it is an opportunity for us to double down on some skills and some understandings that can change the profession forever. So I'm with you. I'm fighting the good fight with you. Let's protect this institution of teaching in public schools. This is a critical moment for this thing that we care so much about. So thank you very much for spending the time, and continued good luck to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye all. Thank you very much. We'll have the recordings up by the end of the week, so share them with your colleagues that weren't able to make it.
Perfect. Thanks, Brittany.
Everyone.